Good morning, fellow linguists. I am James Nolan, former Deputy Director of the United Nations Meetings, Interpreting and Publishing Division, and former Chief of the UN Verbatim Reporting Service, a job in which it was my responsibility to ensure that speeches given at the UN were correctly interpreted and reported in the official records. Having served as a language officer in intergovernmental organizations for some 30 years, I retired in 2007 to begin conducting a series of interpreter training seminars and workshops, an experience on which I now draw for the short talks that I have been invited to give by YAPTI. In this second talk, I would like to touch upon the question of interpreting error, a problem addressed in the statement of 31 May 2019 by the President of the YAPTI Board in connection with the imprisonment of the Korean interpreter Shin Hye-young, who interpreted at the Hanoi Summit meeting between President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un on 28 February 2019, following what was referred to as a critical error. According to news reports, the Hanoi Summit was deemed not fully successful because one of the parties broke off the negotiation and walked out. A summary of the incident on the website of the Council of Foreign Relations reads as follows, quote, February 28, 2019, second Trump-Kim summit ends early without deal. Trump and Kim's second summit, held in Vietnam, collapses after the leaders disagree over sanctions relief and denuclearization. Trump says Kim agreed to dismantle the nuclear and fissile material production facilities at Yongbyon in exchange for complete sanctions relief, but the U.S. president wanted more substantial steps on denuclearization and verification. North Korean officials dispute Trump's account, saying Kim demanded only partial sanctions relief. Both leaders leave Vietnam early without signing a planned joint statement, but indicate talks will continue. Trump says they parted on friendly terms, while North Korea's foreign ministry warns it will not change its position. According to an AFP report in the South Korean newspaper Chosun Ilbo, Kim Jong-un's interpreter, Shin Hye-young, was sent to a prison camp for a mistake at the summit. Quote, she failed to translate Kim's new proposal when Trump declared no deal and walked away from the table, Chosun reported, citing another unnamed diplomatic source. Kim Jong-un and Trump left the Vietnamese capital without a deal after they failed to reach agreement on rolling back Pyongyang's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Another reputable newspaper, the South China Morning Post, suggests that a further reason for the breakdown of the talks may have been a tough bargaining position taken by Mr. Trump, which was communicated not through interpreted speech, but in writing. At the Hanoi Summit, Donald Trump asked Kim Jong-un to hand over North Korea's nuclear weapons. The American president handed the North Korean leader a piece of paper containing a blunt call for the transfer of Pyongyang's nuclear bombs and their fuel to the U.S. Close quote. The news report does not say whether this written statement was shared with or conveyed through the interpreter present who was interpreting for the two parties. But a blunt call to give in to demands does not seem conducive to fruitful negotiations. And Mr. Trump is known to show some measure of disdain for interpreted communication, which was displayed by him even removing and dropping his earpiece in the midst of an interpreted event at a G20 meeting. According to the Council of Foreign Relations, nuclear negotiations between the United States and North Korea have proceeded in fits and starts across 3 decades and have failed to halt the advance of the North's atomic weapons. Thus, it would have been remarkable for a 3-decade deadlock to be broken at a single summit meeting. Both parties deserve praise for trying, but it is not surprising that they failed, and it is eminently unfair to blame the failure on the interpreter. Failure to come to terms is not always the result of linguistic or rhetorical considerations. It is more often due to irreconcilable differences at the time of the negotiation. Interpreters can help to facilitate communication and ease the way toward agreement by fostering trust, but they cannot accomplish the impossible. In this case, it seems unlikely that the failure of the negotiation was due to anything like misinterpretation. Rather, it seems that the parties were unable to find common ground regarding the complex substantive issues at stake. They reached an impasse and decided to interrupt the process while they were still on speaking terms, while agreeing to resume talks at a later date. Ending a meeting in that way, without a written statement, is a common occurrence in international relations, where some negotiations can go on for decades. It does not amount to a total breakdown, and such a failure, even if it had been due to an error on the part of the interpreter, would not justify such a severe penalty as imprisonment in a prison camp, if anything would. It seems more likely that the obstacles at work here were inflexibility, confusion, or ambiguity emanating from one of the parties to this negotiation. Interactions with world leaders have left interpreters scratching their heads about how to communicate what Trump is trying to say, when his speech even baffles English speakers, according to a comment in The Guardian. In this case, according to the newspaper reports about the event, it appears that Mr. Trump had in fact ended the conversation, declared no deal, by walking away from his interlocutor. If that is the case, it would arguably have been an error for the interpreter to attempt to convey anything further that Kim Jong-un had to say at that point. The conversation was, for the time being, finished. Viewed in terms of court interpreting practices, the interpreter would arguably have been adding to the spoken material, which is considered an error in court proceedings. What then is an interpreting error? Most interpreting errors occur when an interpreter is forced to talk too fast, which is also why many go unnoticed. Inadvertent transpositions of sounds, such as confusing similar words like statements and statesmen, are not interpreting errors, since they occur within one and the same language in everyday speech. The same can be said of common mispronunciations and malapropisms. And when an interpreter misuses language because the speaker has done so, it is not an interpreting error, although many interpreters will try to correct such errors when they can. An interpreting error occurs when words properly used in the source language are improperly rendered in the target language, in such a manner that the meaning conveyed is misleading to some or all of the members of the audience, or is conveyed in the wrong tone or register. Sometimes, especially at expert meetings, an unfamiliar term, misused by the interpreter, will not mislead anyone, and will merely cause a few smiles or furrowed brows. But it is an error when an interpreter says something substantially different, or omits a significant point, or renders the speaker's meaning in the wrong tone or register. It may be useful, therefore, to distinguish between trivial errors or lapsus linguae on the one hand, and non-trivial or substantive errors on the other. However, not all substantive interpreting errors are critical, because live interpretation in real time is not, by definition, a complete and perfect mirror image of the original. It sometimes happens that the combination of complexity, detail, and speed will cause speaking errors, or lapsus linguae, in the original source language speech, such as inadvertent repetitions, stumbling, inappropriate pauses in mid-sentence, or slurred pronunciation of certain words. This often occurs when a speaker is nervous or is reading out a prepared speech and coping with a time limit. A court interpreter might allow for such features of speech to show through in the target language, but a conference interpreter will normally strive to minimize them. How should substantive interpretation errors be corrected? Substantive interpreting errors, those which could affect the course of the discussion if they went unnoticed and unrectified, need to be corrected, and it is the interpreter's responsibility to take whatever steps are necessary to avoid or rectify misunderstandings. This is best done at the end of an exchange or meeting by bringing an error to the attention of the speaker, the presiding officer, and or the record writers. If the course of a discussion or negotiation has been affected by an interpreting error, the correction should be made as soon as possible. On the other hand, interpreters should avoid apologizing on the microphone for a trivial slip of the tongue, which creates unnecessary distractions. When there is a perceived error, overreacting by punishing an interpreter who has done her best, according to the standards of the profession, is not only pointless and unfair, but actually counterproductive, inspiring discouragement, inhibiting good performance, by aggravating nervous tension, and making it difficult to recruit the best interpreters for substantive, high-level negotiations. Thank you.